Hi and welcome to Megabytes on Periscope. I'm Govindra Jaithiraj. This is a show in partnership with Twitter where we speak to leaders in business and technology. We all use the word disruption frequently. We hear of businesses that are disrupting businesses, like Uber is doing to the transportation industry. We hear of ideas that are transforming and even thus disrupting organizations. But we rarely pause to ask, what are the big disruptive forces that are blowing in my direction? And what can they do to me as a manager, a student, or even an aspiring entrepreneur? And more so, how can I be alert and prepare for it? To discuss this, I'm joined by Nandan Nilekani, co-founder of Infosys, former chairman of the Unique Identification Authority of India, who has been speaking on disruption and its ability to change our very lives. Nandan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Govind. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Nandan, let me start with a sort of broad question today, and a question which sort of is applicable or relevant in today's context. What does disruption really mean in India to me at this point?
Well, I think there are three kinds of disruption for the individual. The first is the nature of knowledge is changing rapidly. The world is accelerating new ideas and new knowledge at a frenetic pace. And part of being relevant and being productive and useful in our jobs in society requires us to be in a continuous learning mode and make sure that we are up to date on the developments and so on. So there's one aspect is the impact on learning and being able to be continuously up to date. The second aspect is the nature of jobs is changing. Disruption is leading to the many old jobs going away, many new jobs being created, and therefore being alert to the fact that the role that you're doing today may not exist tomorrow, and the role that you're doing tomorrow may not exist today. I think being on top of that is also very important. So both in terms of knowledge as well as the jobs of the future, things are changing rapidly.
Right. So what are the areas that you see disruption impacting us the most? You've been talking a lot about, for instance, disruption in the financial services industry, or for that matter, transportation, where it's fairly evident to us because we all use Ubers and Olas. But where else is it going to happen, and in what way?
Well, clearly the fintech disruption is the biggest, which is staring at us in the face, and mobility is affected by a combination of Uber or Olaization, electric cars, and self-driving cars. But it's happening. I mean, media has already seen disruption. I mean, in the last 10 years, media revenue has gone away from newspapers and now from television, and essentially concentrating on large internet giants like Facebook and Google. So media is affected. Healthcare is going to get affected with better diagnostic point-of-sale devices and the use of big data and machine learning. So I think education we think will be disrupted, and some of the work that we are all doing at Xstep is related to disruption of education. So I think every aspect of our lives has some disruptive element, and that's what Mark Andreessen said when he said that software eats the world. The software tends to take over many things. Retail is another example of a great disruption with the rise of Amazon and Flipkart and others. So it's all over.
Right. So if you were to look at one or two specific areas, so let's say financial services or transportation, or you talked about media as well, is this likely to start affecting jobs, and is it likely to start affecting livelihoods? And I guess it's already happening in some ways.
Oh, it will, because you see, let's take banking, which historically had a lot of people, and the way you became a strong bank was by having lots of branches all over the country. And in the branch, you would have employees who provide both front office service as well as back office administrative services. Tomorrow, if the mobile phone is the branch, and if a customer is getting all his services through the mobile phone, then the nature of the need for having a physical bank branch goes away, and those jobs will start tapering off. Similarly, in the ultimate analysis, if you see what these guys like Google and Tesla and Uber and all are trying to do, if ultimately you have self-driving cars, then you don't need anyone to even drive the car. So, these are all some of them have very long-term thing, not immediate. So all these things can happen in retailing. the in-store retail clerk may not be there, but there may be a huge demand for people who deliver things, because logistics and home delivery became important. So the balance shifts and the kind of jobs created will shift.
Right. So are we, I mean, and I'm going to focus a little more on the people side. Are we temperamentally ready for this as a country, as citizenry?
Well, it's not just an India problem. I think it's a global problem. Many of the things you see happening in the United States and the rise of Trump and all that is because people are finding that jobs are getting affected. Initially, we thought the jobs were getting affected by outsourcing, and therefore there was this big anti-globalization kind of movement. But increasingly, more jobs are probably getting lost due to automation. I mean, earlier there used to be somebody at the checkout lane of a supermarket, but now checkout is done automatically and so on. So I think the combination of outsourcing in the Western countries as well as automation is affecting everywhere, and India is no different from that. I mean, for example, we know that China was able to build a very successful nation on manufacturing. But in today's world where there is overcapacity in so many commodities and automation and robotics and 3D, manufacturing as a job creator may not be a valid strategy for India. So all these things have to be thought about as we look forward.
Right, Nandan, but a lot of people seem to, I mean, they may partly agree with you, but they also believe that, you know, what is the choice for a country like India? You can't be a complete services economy. Your entire population can't be, let's say, running tourism related businesses. So what's the way out? I mean, is manufacturing a complete dead end from here on?
No, see, manufacturing is not decided because you want to do manufacturing. Manufacturing is decided because the market can absorb manufacturing. I'll give an example of shoes. Adidas has 1 million employees working for them in Asia making shoes. But just a few months back, they set up 2 robotics factories in Germany, which make 500,000 shoes each with something like 600 employees per shoe factory. And this is the first time in 23 years that shoe manufacturing had come back to Germany from Asia. And they make, some 300 million shoes. Now, if they start making these shoes all in Germany, that's one less manufacturing jobs to make shoes in Asia. Right. So it's not that we have control over this and we just put people into manufacturing and hope something will happen. The market should enable companies to sustainably make things. And that is where the challenge is, or what's happening with commodities. There's massive overcapacity in China on steel. Soon it will be on coal and nickel and copper and all kinds of things. And then those kind of commodities, manufacturing them will become very difficult. So both the combination of the China oversupply factor and automation makes it very difficult to think of manufacturing as a driver of growth, job growth.
Right, yeah, I guess steel is a classic example. I think India is about 86 million tons, China has 10 times that of capacity. So there is little opportunity for us to create steel capacity unless we set up boundaries or raise tariff barriers.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good example. What I'm saying is that when the Japanese and the Koreans and the Chinese and Southeast Asia all became, developed countries, I mean, their per capita incomes are much higher than India's. They all did it on the back of exports and manufacturing. But in an era of deglobalization and in an era of automation and overcapacity, that playbook may not be available to India. And we have to think differently about how to make sure 1 billion people have good jobs and good incomes.
Right. So that's really my next question, Nandan. So there is me and there is those who make policy and the government. How do we attack this? I mean, what do, let's say if someone who's watching this and listening to this, and I can see some comments coming already, but what do people do, as in how do I skill myself or reskill myself for this new world?
Well, I think first of all, as I said, at a macro level, everybody in the country has to be literate and numerate. Unless people can read, write and use digital technology, they run the risk of getting left behind. And then of course, as I explained, you need to be in continuous learning mode, because your skills today may not be valid tomorrow. And you must also be adaptable to new jobs, because old jobs which get automated will go away, but you'll create new jobs. and therefore being alert to the new opportunities that are going to come up and then gearing up for them. So it's not like the old days where you joined a company and worked there for 40 years and retired from that company. This is about a very dynamic, fast-changing situation. So people have to be constantly alert to all those things. And socially, obviously, the society should have a good social security net to deal with job transition, unemployment, and all that.
Yeah, and that's an important point, Nandan, because a lot of people actually, and we are seeing agitations around the country, are increasingly depending on government jobs or government as a solution to this gap. So how do we at a policy level address this?
See, there is no way that government can create these jobs working for government, because even with the small number of people in government, already we are bearing a big burden in terms of wages and 7th pay commission and pension overhang and all that. So jobs will have to be created in the private sector, and government obviously has to create an environment where companies can do things well, can sell and grow. And therefore creating the enabling environment for business, the ease of doing business, that's where government, in my view, should focus on. And I think today technology and the kind of things we have done in India, building digital infrastructure, actually makes it possible to do business in a far more efficient and effective manner.
Right. So you talked about the need to be literate and ready for this world. Now, I'm not sure. So if you look at education infrastructure today, and you're associated with this world as well, and trying to fix that problem, are we in real terms, are we really ready for this? And if so, how do we accelerate it? Or how do I self-accelerate my learning here?
No, I think we need a massive overhaul of our education sector. At one end, at the primary level, we really need to do something to improve learning outcomes. Because one of the lessons we have learned in the last 10 to 15 years is, while we have been able to increase enrollment in schools at the primary level, the learning outcomes have not improved, as shown by reports like the ASA report that Pratham does. At the other end, our higher education is too rigid and too stratified, and simply not preparing people for the new world. So we need a complete overhaul of our education, both at the primary end as well as at the higher education end. And unfortunately, I don't see the sense of urgency and the need to transform this in a very radical manner, which is the only way we can meet the aspirations of our young people who are looking for a better life.
Right. So if I would ask you this question, what's the one thing that you've been disrupted the most by, or something that you did not see coming, but in actually, arrived suddenly and by force, and you were forced to, either change, relearn, respond?
Well, I think, for me, as someone whose entire career has been at technology and the interface of technology to business, I think the biggest thing has been how technology's center of gravity has moved from the enterprise to the consumer. I mean, 10 years back, all the big companies were companies that sold technology and hardware and software to businesses. And so it was the time of, Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, and of course the Indian tech companies. But today, I mean, these companies are still very, very good companies, but today the center of gravity has moved to consumer companies, to Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, Amazon. So this shift from enterprise to consumer was a very quick shift. And certainly it took me some time to understand that this was a very large change that was happening around us.
Right. So if I were to, it's not easy to come up with tools for this, but let me ask you for a few. So what are the 1 or 2 books that you would recommend, which you feel that will, point people in the right direction? It could be books aimed at, let's say, a manager, or maybe a CEO or a student, in the context of disruption and how it's changing our lives.
Well, I think there are quite a few, people writing on disruption. The classic disruption work was done by Clayton Christensen at Harvard. But the new thinking on platforms as opposed to pipes. There's a very good young management thinker called Sangeet Paul Chowdhury, based in Singapore, who's written a book called Platform Scale and Platform Thinking, I think. And so I think I found those books are very useful in thinking of business and society as platforms. we at XStep are thinking of societal platforms, platforms that impact society. And then, of course, I make it a point to read, publications like The Economist, Financial Times, The Wall Street Journal, and specialist publications like The Information, or Indian publications like India Spend, or The Ken, or Factor Daily. So I have a very broad spectrum of things I read, and I meet a lot of people, and that's how I keep up to date.
Right, and I mean, just to come back to the tools part, so apart from media itself, is there something else that I should be following as, like I said, as a manager, as a young student, where I'm sort of aware, abreast, and more than just the knowledge that comes to me, but I'm internally ready for change, because that's a little different from saying that I will adopt and I will learn.
Yeah, no, I think internally one has to be unafraid of change, because change is the only reality. And if one is going to go in life resisting change, then you're always going to be on the wrong end of the stick. So I think internally you should be prepared for that. We are in a world of fast change, and that it is best to embrace change rather than fight it. I mean, that's one big lesson for everyone, especially in today's world where things are changing even more rapidly than ever before. And then, of course, being well-read, being networked, attending events, meeting other like-minded people, being curious about what's happening, all this helps you in facing change. Main thing is embrace change and don't shy away from it.
Right. And one last sort of more practical question. So you talked about financial services, we talked about transportation, media. Are there some industries where people should be more concerned and more on the alert than perhaps others?
No, I think financial services disruption is like happening right now, and I've talked about it in many forums. The automobile disruption in India will take longer, because I think we are still many years away from electric cars or self-driving cars. But the urban aggregation of Ola and Uber is here to come. Retail in India, I think, is going through change, with different forms of e-commerce coming, not only to new e-commerce players, but even traditional mom and pop stores are going to use technology. Media, I think, in India is going to face some of the challenges of the West, which is the migration of digital advertising to digital medium, which leads to new players making the money. So I think the same thing is playing out here, which is playing out elsewhere, because India has got a very rapid growth in smartphones. Indian language software is now becoming common. We have things like the Indus OS, which is the India-specific OS, or Reverie, which develops Indian language technology, or Daily Hunt, which provides Indian language news on the smartphone. So all these guys are creating whole new paradigms.
Right. Nandan, we've run out of time almost. Is there one last sort of phrase, idiom, motto, thought that you would like to leave with us in the context of how we or I am going to combat or could combat disruption in my life?
Well, I think, as I said, embrace change, don't fight it, and always be ahead of the curve in learning what's happening tomorrow.
Right, Nandan. Thank you so much for joining us on Megabytes, a Twitter Boom partnership. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Govind. Thank you so much for having me on the show.